We structured these meetings around a few core themes. First, to explore whether certain interventions can lessen harms from disinformation campaigns, whether they are scalable, and whether they might impose unintended consequences. Second, to discuss if one can still develop or enforce laws against disinformation actors who have acquired outsized wealth and power. Third, to understand how influencers leverage perceived and legitimate grievance around economic or social psychological conditions to build communities that support exploitive movements in both finance, crypto, and politics. And to build forth threat awareness and resilience for those of us in this community who engage in research or advocacy around information risks. On that latter point, we are a community under real threat, as we'll explore a lot more in the next few days. Why do these threats exist? As I noted in our prior summit in 2023, some people have financial, social, psychological, power, and/or physical incentives to intentionally spread false or misleading narratives to targeted audiences through selected dissemination channels for exploitation. These might be people who, for example, engage in financial fraud, which is what my field deals with, grooming victims for sexual assault, and/or building or sustaining authoritarian governments as some examples. Our collective work has the potential to expose or intervene against their harm campaigns, and our independence makes them uncomfortable. One of their most common tactics is reputation assassination, which is its own disinformation campaign. For example, this community is often falsely accused of engaging in censorship, which is not something we support in these meetings, nor is it typically something we support in our research. We are conducting these meetings under the University of Cambridge's Code of Practice on Free Speech, which holds freedom of thought and expression as core values and, quote, encourages staff, students, and visitors to engage in robust, challenging, evidence-based, and civil debate as a core part of academic inquiry and wider university activity, even if you find the viewpoints expressed to be disagreeable, unwelcome, or distasteful. In addition, we're hosting authors who are going to discuss their research that examine as examples warning messages to audiences which are themselves protected free speech, enhanced fact-checking after messages arrive, which is also protected free speech, learning or deliberation that might make people reflect on their own personal vulnerability or question the veracity of narratives before they share or believe them. None of this promotes censorship. As scientists, we inherently uphold independent thinking, yet we are also being falsely accused of political bias. For example, when we do not present both sides of a narrative or present cases on both sides of a political spectrum. Throughout history, disinformation campaigns arise across political spectrums. This summit project has not set out to highlight any particular political group. In general, we ask our speakers to focus on structural elements and impact of disinformation campaigns and to use specific cases for illustration as primary. This is because tomorrow's actors might have completely different incentives and objectives, so it seems more informative to focus on the underlying core architecture that applies to all forms of information-fueled harms campaigns in history or in the future. However, we cannot ignore that there are political forces right now who seem to present an existential threat to our independence and who will falsely accuse us of bias when we defend against that threat. They tend to deploy legal, reputational, institutional, and financial weapons to shut down or silence independent research on topics like climate, health, inequality, or information risks. This puts us in an untenable position where the research community has to defend against their actions to remain independent. If your actions threaten my independence, then my defense of my independence, which I will defend unapologetically, does not make me biased. In fact, our work requires evidential support, ethics panel approval, peer review, and editorial consideration. While this is not infallible, our research process deserves a lot more credence, in my opinion, than the typically unvetted claims from actors who host glaring conflicts of interest to try to discredit our research en masse. The fact that these actors threaten us indicates that our work has impact. I want to reiterate that last point. They would not threaten this community if our work did not matter. So we convene here to continue our work. We do not need government approval to do scientific work. In fact, the root of science is innate individual curiosity. All it takes is for any single human being to be curious, to pose a question in their mind, and to explore that question and collect data. That is the heart of science. That process, to me, is organic, and I see our primary imperative as a community is to keep the pilot light lit so that our innate internal curiosity can continue to burn in each of us, and we can hand that flame down to the next generation. I'm thankful that this assembly represents and illustrates the power of literally thousands of colleagues who've reached out to us across the world, from across many, many disciplines, who commit to mentor the next generation of scholars and become advocates to carry on this work. To support our resilience and efficacy, I'll close with a few reflections about how I think we should engage going forward. First, to fulfill our duty to keep the pilot light lit for scientific independence, I believe we should back up, store offline, and widely disseminate our data and writings, and do it with serious urgency. I think we need to work more with globally dispersed colleagues. think we need to mentor more of our junior colleagues and do that quickly. And I think we need to communicate our inferences across multiple venues beyond publishing in academic journals. This would include publishing short, accessible, and relatable video content on popular media platforms. We, too, can be influencers, and I think we should lean into that more. I also think we need to strictly adhere to and role model proper scientific standards, including openness, transparency, and accountability. This includes current standard practice like providing open access to data and code, discussing a whole myriad of other plausible alternative hypotheses and inferences, and why we've arrived at the ones we believe are the most plausible, disclosing any and all potential conflicts of interest, discussing unintended policy consequences if our research proposes systems or policy change, welcoming others to challenge our models, challenge our assumptions or our data, or to provide new evidence to update, refute, or support our inferences. However, I feel we should hold those who challenge our work to the same level of standard. We cannot, in my opinion, passively tolerate ad hominem or conflated broad brush challenges to our research from actors who do not adhere to the same standards. We must try to hold them accountable to the same standards, recognizing that some appear to have no intention to be held accountable to any ethical standards. This means, I think, we have to lean into uncomfortable roles, such as public advocacy, political lobbying, and potentially confrontational influence. In order to preserve scientific independence, we must be willingly active to defend it. We have to be willing to actively defend it. At a minimum, I think we should insist challengers tell us what's wrong with the analysis and provide logic and evidence instead of simply dismissing or outright censoring an entire line of inquiry. I think we also need to expose their campaign agenda. We can publicly expose, for example, their conflicts of interest, their incentives, their intended audience, and the potential harms to this audience from engaging a narrative campaign that undermines our research independence and our perceived credibility. Our independence requires us not to cede ground to their tactics, and I certainly won't. Finally, I think we should recognize that we are perceived by some to be in an elitist echo chamber, which I think has some merit, including with our assembly in this pristine hall today. I think we should acknowledge that some people will not trust us if we write papers only for each other, communicate with jargon and unnecessarily complex word choices, toss around our titles and institutional affiliations to command respect or lecture instead of listen. I also think, having looked at this for many, many years now, disinformation is fueled more by the human condition than by the messaging. I think our most promising interventions are probably the ones that consider human factors that lead people to engage with intentionally misleading information, and to congregate in communal echo chambers that consume self-reinforcing narratives. How people arrive into these communal echo chambers offers a solid handover to our opening keynote speaker, who will offer his insights with depth on that topic.